Welcome to part 17 of this tutorial on Excel VBA user forms. This fairly long video is going to look at how you can use a user form to edit data in a worksheet. So it's a long video not because really any part of it's particularly complex, it's just that there's a lot of steps involved to get this to work. So we'll start by looking at how we can create an edit mode for the form we've been building in this tutorial series so far. We'll use a couple of slightly more advanced programming topics to help us with this. We'll look at how you can declare both enumerations and properties, which lets us modify the form in code outside the form. We'll then look at how you can get the form to modify data in the worksheet. So we'll do that first of all by looking at the control source property, and then show you why that's a slightly bad idea for this particular form that we've created. So we'll look at then how we can write code that explicitly reads data directly into the controls on a form. We'll spend a bit of time looking at how to navigate records, and also to allow the user to search for records by name or by number. And then we'll also look at, of course, how we can write the changes that the user has made back out to the worksheet. The last little part is going to show you how you can use the form to delete a record that we're looking at, and there won't be any way to undo that, so we'll have to take a little bit of care when this happens. So quite a lot of things to do here. Let's get started. Okay, so here's what we're going to aim to create in this video. We've already seen our form many times before when we add new films, which lets us fill in the details and add the data to the list. We've now got a new data mode for the form, whereby if we click the Edit Films button, it pops up with a little record navigation section. So it also loads the details for the first film in our list, which happens to be Avatar. Now we can start scrolling through the records using the record navigation buttons, so we can navigate between each one, and it loads all the details for that film into the form. We can also jump to a specific record by typing in its number and then hitting the tab key or just navigating away from that text box. We could also search for a film by name, so we can type in partial film matches. If I type in letter S, for instance, and then start scrolling through, it'll show me all the films that have a letter S anywhere in their title, and I can scroll through all of those, and it'll scroll through forwards or backwards. I can also make modifications, so I can just get rid of the search and then look for record number 6 again, which happens to be Deadpool, and I can update data in the form, so I can update its runtime, its film gross in US dollars. If I click the Save Changes button, that will update the data, so if I navigate away from that record and then navigate back to it, it's retained the changes. And I've also got a way to delete films as well, so if I navigate to the last record, which is Twilight, I can choose to delete it by clicking the cross. I'm asked if I want to confirm the deletion, and I can click yes. I've never been more sure of anything in my life that I want to delete Twilight. If only I could delete it from existence rather than just our basic list of films in this worksheet. So basically we're creating a way for you to modify data in an Excel worksheet using a VBA form. Quite a lot to do to get this system to work, so let's get stuck in. The first thing we're going to do is tidy up a little bit on the menu sheet. We've got a few buttons that we don't really need anymore. So we've got a basic form button at the top here, which the simplest way to get rid of this is to right click on it and then just choose to cut it. We're not going to paste it anywhere, we'll just get rid of it entirely. We've also got this simple auto shape, so I'm going to do the same thing here, right click and cut. Then we've got a couple of ActiveX buttons as well. We're going to keep the Film Revenue button, but I want to get rid of the Show Form button. So I'm going to head to the Developer tab and go into Design Mode by clicking the Design Mode button, and then I can select the button safely and then just hit the Delete key on the keyboard to remove it. I'm going to shift the Film Revenue button up towards the top of this sheet. Just a quick tip for you: if you want to get your buttons to line up exactly with the borders of your cells, if you hold down the Alt key while you either click and drag to move them or you resize them, you'll find that the buttons snap exactly to the borders of those cells. So if you're a bit of a perfectionist, then you'll find that quite a useful tip, hopefully. A couple of new buttons then as well. I'm going to head to the Insert menu on the Developer tab, and I'm going to choose to insert one new ActiveX control first of all. So I'm going to draw that somewhere here, and then again resize it and position it so it sits in neatly with the cells. I'm going to show the Properties window so that I can modify a couple of things about the button. So first of all, I'm going to change its name. This one's going to say Show Form in Add Mode. And then I'm going to change its caption so that it says something like Add New Film. Then let's have another button. If I just move the Properties window out of the way, back to the Insert menu, draw another button just below, and this one is going to be called, let's just quickly reposition and resize it. So let's call this one Show Form in Edit Mode. And then the caption will say something like Edit Films. Okay, so having done that, I'm going to close down the properties window and then exit from design mode. And those are the buttons we're going to add some code to now to launch the form in different modes. A simple way to see the code sitting behind the worksheet then is to just right click on its tab at the bottom, so I can right click on the menu sheet tab and choose view code, and that will show us all the code that we've added in previously for some of our other objects. We're going to add some code to the click event of the two new buttons we've just drawn. So if I can head to the drop down list at the top left hand corner of the code window, I'll find that my new buttons are listed up here. So I can choose the show form in add mode button first of all, and that gives me the default event handler for that button, the click event. The first thing we're going to do here actually is exactly the same as we've done previously for the button that I deleted earlier on. So I'm just going to copy and paste these two lines from the procedure that we had earlier on for our previous button. Then I'm just going to tidy up a little bit again and delete this procedure. This procedure isn't linked to any object anymore. We've deleted the button to which the event handler is attached. So I'm going to delete the code that's associated with that as well, just to keep things a little bit tidier. And then again, going to the drop down list at the top left hand corner first of all, I'm going to choose the show form in edit mode button. And then again, I'm going to paste in exactly the same two lines of code. The basic difference between the add mode and the edit mode of the form is which mode it's actually loaded in. So in between the two lines in each of these procedures, we're going to add in an extra line of code that changes the mode of the form. Now Excel forms don't have a data entry mode property, so we need to create one ourselves. So to do that, let's head into the code view of our film details form. I'm going to right click on the object and then choose to view its code. You'll probably notice that the properties window has disappeared again from when we displayed it in the Excel window itself. So to bring the properties window back, the simplest thing to do is press the F4 key on the keyboard. Alternatively, you can head to the view menu and choose the properties window from the view menu as well. Anyway, having reached the code view of our film details form, we're going to simply declare a public variable at the top of the form, which allows us to set its data mode. So I'm going to create a public variable. To begin with, I only want this to store a simple number, and I'm going to call the variable form data mode. And as there are only two options, basically, I'm going to use one of the basic data types, which is byte. So public form data mode as byte. The way that I'd like to use this, I'd like to assume that if the value of this was set to 0, then the form is in add mode, and if it was set to 1, then the form is in edit mode. So to modify that, what we're going to do is head back to the code view of our menu worksheet. So again, a quick way to do this is to either double click the menu sheet here or to right click on it and choose view code. And then, if I've clicked the show form in add mode button, once I've loaded the form into memory, I want to change its form data mode property. So I can do this now by saying film details, which is a reference to the form object of course, and now that I've declared that public variable, I'll be able to see a form data mode property sitting in the list. So I can say form data mode equals, and I said 0 for add mode, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing for the edit mode. I'm going to say film details dot form data mode equals, and I'm going to go for 1 for the edit mode. Now that we've set the values up and changed them when we've loaded the form, we need some way to detect when the values are set and then do the appropriate thing to the form based on which data mode we've chosen. One of the basic things I'd like to do when the form is opened in edit mode is for a couple of the options on the form to be disabled. So just to quickly demonstrate that, if I switch back into Excel and if I click on the Edit Films button, if I launch the form in edit mode, I don't want the user to be able to click on the Add to List button. And I don't want them to be able to sort by ID either, or sort by name, or change the sort order of the records. So what we're going to do is make sure that when the form loads, we disable these two buttons. So I'm just going to cancel the form and then head back to the Visual Basic Editor. So the two buttons that we're going to modify are going to be the Add to List button, which is called Add to List, and the Sort by ID button, which is actually called Sort by Title. So I need to get to the code view of the form again, so a quick way to do that is to right click on the form object and choose View Code. And we're going to use the activate event of the form to get this to work. So when the form has been loaded, we're going to use the activate event to detect which data mode it's been opened with. So let's scroll down to find the user form object in the drop-down list from the top left-hand corner, and then that takes us to the initialize event of the form. It's worthwhile mentioning actually we've used the initialize event previously to set up all of the default values for our form. We can't use the initialize event to get this to work. The reason for that is if I just switch back to the menu worksheets code, The form data mode is being changed after we load the form into memory. In fact, we have to load the form into memory before we can modify the data mode of the form, before we can change anything about it. In fact, you don't actually have to have a load film details line explicitly, but even with the film details.format data mode line here, if we're changing that property, the form has to be initialized first before this property can be changed. So we can't use the initialize event to change the data mode because the initialize event will have already happened at the point we attempt to change it. So for that reason we're going to use the activate event instead. So I'm going to go back to the code view of the form, and then rather than the initialize event we're going to use the activate event instead. So let's do it this way. Here all we need to do then is detect what the data mode of the form is. So we're going to write a simple if statement that's going to say if form data mode equals, and I know that it's the number 1 if we've opened it in edit mode, so I'm going to check if it's equal to 1. Then there are 2 buttons that I want to disable. One was called add to list, that was the name of the button, so I'm going to say add to list dot enabled equals false, and the other one was called sort by title, so sort by title dot enabled equals false as well. Otherwise I'm going to just make sure that those buttons are enabled, so let's just quickly copy and paste those 2 lines, change these to true, and then don't forget to add in the end if as well. So a quick simple little test of this now. If I switch back into Excel and if I launch the form with the add new film button, I'll see that I can click add to list and sort by ID, those are clearly enabled. If I cancel the form, if I launch it via the edit films button instead, I'll see that these buttons, you can see they're sort of greyed out and disabled. So we've successfully managed to modify the form based on what data mode we've opened it in. Before we move on, I'd just like to make a small improvement to the way we set the data mode of the form. So far we've just used a simple numeric value, 0 for add and 1 for edit. What I'd really like to do, back in the code view of the form, and just scrolling all the way back up to the top, because that's a little bit obscure, I'd like to create a more descriptive method for stating what the data mode of the form is. To do that we're going to use something called an enumeration. We've created a video on enumerations in the main Excel VBA tutorial series, so if you've seen that video before you'll be right at home with what we're about to do here. If not, it's worth a quick watch. I'm not going to go into a massive amount of detail with this particular video, but there's a full video that explains exactly what enumerations are and how they work. The basics of declaring enumerations, I'm going to declare this within the forms module, within the forms code page. It's going to be public because I'd like it to be accessible to other modules in this project. So I'm going to say public enum, and then I'm going to call it form data modes. A couple of blank lines and then type in end enum, and then in between these 2 lines we can declare all of the individual entries, all of the individual constants that belong to this enumeration. So we're going to have 2. We're going to have the first one called add mode, which I'm going to assign a value of 0 to. That will actually be the default anyway. When you declare enumerations, sorry, I meant 0, beg pardon, rather than 1. Add mode is 0 and edit mode is 1. So enumerated values, constants in an enumeration will be assigned a value anyway. So if I say add mode and edit mode, then add mode would automatically be 0 and edit mode would automatically be 1. They're listed, they're then numbered in the order in which you add them. But you can assign any numeric value, any whole number value, any integer value to a constant in an enumeration. So if for some bizarre reason you wanted this to be add mode was 12 and edit mode was 1, you could do things that way as well. Let's go back to the original values though, 0 and 1. What we're then going to do is make sure that the data type of our form data mode property isn't a byte any longer, it's a form data modes. That's the data type of that variable. What we can now do, if we go back to the code behind the menu worksheet, is if I take away the part where it says film details.form data mode equals 0, and if I just type in the 0 again, you'll see that we have this lovely little enumerated list of constants. So I can use a much more descriptive piece of code to set the data mode, so for anybody else reading what we're doing here, this would make a lot more sense hopefully than just using the value 0. So I'm going to say add mode for the add mode click button, and then rather than equals 1 we're going to say equals edit mode. So a simple little tweak, but it makes the whole set of code a lot more readable personally, I think. We can use the same technique in the if statement in the form's activate event. Rather than using the values 1 and 0 to check which data mode the form is in, we can now use the enumerations instead. So to do that, let's head back to the code view of the form. We can right click and choose view code, and then we can select the user form from the list to get straight to its events, and we'll get to the activate event. And here, rather than checking if the form data mode equals 1, we can instead say if form data mode equals edit mode. Interestingly, we could have left that as equals 1. The value of the enumeration is the same as the underlying number itself, so it really doesn't matter here whether you use 1 or edit mode. They will do exactly the same thing at this point because edit mode is equivalent to 1. But I think again this makes the whole thing a lot more readable if we use the enumeration rather than the underlying value. The last little tweak I'd like to make to this system is to change the point at which these buttons are enabled and disabled. Currently we're waiting until the form is activated, and that's triggered when the form is displayed on screen, so when the show method is applied to the form. We shouldn't really have to wait until the form is displayed on screen. We should be able to detect when the data mode of the form changes. At that point we should be able to modify the status of these buttons, whether they're enabled or disabled. Currently we don't have any way to do that. I suppose we do have one way to do it, but it's quite a long-winded, boring way. What we could do is, in the code behind the menu worksheet, we could say that if we're clicking on the add mode button, then we could change the data mode of the form, and then we could also enable the two buttons. If we clicked on the edit mode button, then we could disable the two buttons. So we could write out all the code in this little section here. But that's going to make these procedures quite long, and it's kind of taking code associated with the form outside of the form, and I want to do that as little as possible. What we really need to be able to do is detect when the value of the form data mode property changes. With this basic public variable that we have currently in the form, sitting right at the very top, this public form data mode property, variable, we have no way to detect when it changes. If we want to be able to detect when a value changes, the best technique to use probably is to create something called a property. Now, if you've watched our video in the previous in the full Excel VBA series on class modules, you'll be right at home with how properties work. So what we're going to do next is we're going to convert this public variable into what's called a public property. It'll have the same name and the same data type, and outside of the form it will work in exactly the same way. It's just it gives us a much better way to control exactly when or what happens when the value of this property changes. Again, we've covered the creation of properties extensively in a previous video on class modules, which is part of the other VBA tutorial series, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here, just go through the basic steps required to create a property. And the first step is to convert this public variable into a private one that's stored purely in the form, so I'm going to say private form data mode. And in fact, to indicate that it is private, I'm going to tag a little lowercase p to the start of its name. I know, slightly confusingly, we could use p to indicate public or private, but a convention that is often used is to use a lowercase p to indicate private variables. So having done that, we've now got no way to access the form data mode outside of the form itself. So currently the code inside the menu worksheet isn't going to be able to work. We can't change the form data mode. In fact, if I said film details dot form data mode, suddenly that property doesn't exist externally to the form anymore. So we need a way to expose that property publicly, and to do that, just going back to the code view of the form, we're going to declare a public property. So I'm going to do this at the top of the code page of the form. It doesn't really matter where I do it, but just to keep everything in the same place, I'm going to say public property. Then there are three different forms of a property statement. The one we're going to use here is called let. The other two are set and get, and again I'll refer you back to the class modules video in the Excel VBA tutorial for what those actually mean. But this public property let statement is the one which you need to use to allow a user to pass a value into the property, so it allows us to set the value of the property. So public property let, I'm going to call it form data mode, so that's the original name that we gave to our public variable earlier on, and we need to declare a single parameter, which I'm going to call just the generic word value, and then we have to declare a data type for that, and the data type is going to be form data modes. Okay, if I hit enter at that point, I'll get the end property statement written out for me. And then in here, what we're going to do, the very first thing we're going to do, is whatever value gets passed in via this parameter, I would like to store in our private variable called pFormDataMode. So I can say pFormDataMode equals whatever value gets passed in. I'll just ignore this little IntelliSense list where I'll just hit the escape key to clear it and then refer to the value parameter. So what that means is that whenever the user now passes a value into it, so if I go back to the code behind the menu worksheet, so I'll see now, just to quickly show you, film details dot form data mode. That's now available again in the list. It's indicated as a property again. So whenever a value gets passed in this case the add mode enumeration or constant, if I switch back to the code view of my form, that value gets stored in the private variable in the instance of the form class itself. The main advantage of using a property here is that we now know when the value of the property is changed. So this procedure will be called whenever the form data mode property gets set from any piece of code elsewhere in this project. So if we know that when the form data mode changes there are certain things that we need to do to modify the form, we can just write all the code out here. So again, we're just going to use a simple if statement. We're going to say if value, so again we're just going to be testing what value gets passed in via this parameter. If value equals let's say add mode, then we know that we need to enable the two buttons we talked about before. So there's a button called add to list, and we can say its enabled property is equal to true, and we can say the sort by title button should be enabled as well, so we'll say dot enabled equals true. We'll have an else if that says else if value equals edit mode, then, sorry, I can't spell value properly. I can't speak properly either at this point. So value equals edit mode, and then we're just going to do the reverse. We're going to disable those two buttons. So let's just copy and paste this just to cheat and make it a little bit quicker. So false and false. Okay, there is a variety of other things we can do, and we're going to add to this property as we work further through the video, but at this point that's all we need to do. So the cool thing here now is we can get rid of all of the code behind the activate event of the form. If I select the user form object from the drop down list at the top left hand corner, and if I can find it, there it is, and then that's the activate event, I can either comment out or just in fact delete this procedure altogether. So in fact I'm going to backspace it or delete it to get rid of it entirely. And we'll see now we've got all this code that enables and disables the buttons based on when the value of the form data mode property changes. So if I switch back into Excel, we'll see that to the end user there's no difference. When they launch the form with the add mode button, they can click add to list and sort by ID. If they launch it via the edit films button, then they can't click on those two buttons. So to the end user there's no difference, but for us we know we've got a much better way to control exactly when these things happen. We did one thing when we declared this property that wasn't immediately apparent why we did it. If I just go back to the code view behind my form, when we passed the value into the property, the first thing that I did was store the value passed in this private variable. There's actually no reason that we had to do that to get this small part to work. If I commented that line out or deleted it altogether, this would still currently work in the same way. The reason I did this is just in case later on we need to read the value of the property back. Currently we don't have any way to do that. If I just switch back to the code behind the menu worksheet and just say, for instance, for some particular reason, when I ran another procedure I needed to check what the data mode of the film details form was. If I attempted to do that, if I write a statement that says if film details dot form data mode equals add mode, then I won't bother typing anything into the if statement. I'll just fill in an empty if. I might want to do something important. I'm not actually going to do anything important here. This is purely to demonstrate what happens if I try to click on my add mode button now back in Excel. If I do this, I'll get a compile error that telling me that I'm not allowed to use my property in this way. So currently I'm trying to read the property. Earlier on I changed the value, I wrote the property, so currently I've got a write-only property. I can change its value, but I can't ever check what the value of the property is. You don't tend to encounter many write-only properties in the real world. So what we're going to do, if I just click the OK button here and reset my procedure, what I'm then going to do is go back to the code view of my film details form, and I'm going to create another statement that allows me to read the value of the form data mode property. So I'll do this immediately below the let statement. I'm going to say public property get. So this is the statement that allows us to read the property. We need to make sure that it has exactly the same name as the writing part, the let part of the property. So it's got to be form data mode, and it's got to return a value. We never pass a value into this, or well, in this case we're not going to pass a value into it, but in order to return a value, we need to make sure it has the same data type as the value originally passed in. So it's going to be form data modes. If I just hit enter at that point, we'll get the end property statement again. And all we're going to do here is say that the form data mode, so this works a little bit like a function works. You refer to the name of the procedure, and then you make that equal to the value you want to pass back. Now the value we want to pass back is whatever value is currently stored in this variable, p form data mode. So if I hit the escape key and then just type in p form data mode, I'll try to do that, hit the escape key again. Looks like I'll have to type the whole thing in, p form data mode. I can now read the contents of that variable. So one more time just to quickly check that this doesn't throw my compile error anymore. If I go back to Excel, and if I click my Add New Film button, the form loads successfully, so that implicitly means that I must have been able to check what the value of my film details form data mode property actually is. This was purely for testing, so I'm just going to remove that if statement. That was purely to show you that that now works. And we may see a little bit later on, if not in this video, in a later video in the series, a case where we need to check what the data mode of the form currently is. Okay, so now that we've got the form successfully loading in one of two different data modes, we need to start thinking about how to read the data that's already in the worksheet into the form. So just switching back into Excel, we've got all this data on sheet 1. There's only a few rows of data at this point, but this will work regardless of how many rows we're going to have. What we're going to want to do is be able to keep track of which row we're currently reading. So we're going to create another property for the form which stores the current record ID. We're not actually going to explicitly refer to the ID number. The ID numbers can change, and they could potentially be a non-sequential set of numbers. So what we're going to do really is just keep track of which physical row we're on in the worksheet. And I'm going to make sure we're referring to the row, how many rows we're offset from the header row, effectively. So this row here will be row 1, this will be row 2, and row 3, and so on and so on. It won't matter which order the films are listed in, so remember we can sort either by the ID number or by the film's title based on our form, so it won't matter which order they're sorted in. This will always be row 1, row 2, row 3, etc. So to get started with that, back into the Visual Basic editor and then back to the code view behind the form, we're going to declare another property that keeps track of the current record ID. We'll start by declaring a new private variable at the top of the form's code page. So scrolling back up to the top, just below the previous private variable, we'll declare a new one called private p current record ID. The data type for this will be long, and then we'll need to both read and write the value of that variable at various points throughout the rest of the video. So we're going to create a let and a get property statement. Now it's not important that code outside of this form can read and write the value of this current record ID property. So we're going to declare these rather than as public properties, we'll declare them as private. So giving myself a little bit of space below the previous properties, I'm going to say private property let current record ID. And then it's got to have a value parameter passed into it. So I'm going to say value as long, which is the data type of the variable we've just declared. And then when we pass a value into the current record ID, all we're going to do to begin with is say p current record ID equals value. Now in order to retrieve that value later, or in order to read it, we need a private property get. And this time it's going to be called again current record ID. And the data type that's going to be returned by it is long again. And all that we're going to do is say current record ID equals p current record ID. So it's a much simpler property. We will add a bit more code to the let part of this property later on in the video, but for now that's all we need to do to get this simple property to work. The current record ID property lets us keep track of which record we are currently trying to read, and then later on try to modify as well. So we want to make sure that when the form gets first loaded into edit mode, that we set the current record ID equal to number 1, so it will load the first record. So let's just scroll back up to the property which lets the user change the value of the form data mode. And then what we will do is add a single line of code. So when we set it into edit mode, we want to make sure that the current record ID is set to be equal to a value of 1. The next thing we want to do is once we've set what ID number, what row number we're trying to read, we need some sort of procedure that loads all the data for that particular row into the various controls on the form itself. So to make that work, let's declare a new procedure. So scrolling down a little bit further, just to below where we declared these property statements, we're going to declare a private sub, so just back to a simple subroutine at this point, which is going to be called read film details. And then we'll write all the code in just a moment that will read the contents of the worksheet into the form. But basically, once we have set which record ID we're trying to read, we're then going to call the procedure we've just declared. So again, the call keyword is optional. I tend to add it in myself just to indicate that I'm calling a procedure I've written rather than a built-in VBA function or method. And I'm going to say call read film details. So at that point, what we then need to do is write all the code that will read the contents of the worksheet into the various controls on the form. It will help if we have a variable which we can use to keep track of which physical cell we're looking at for each individual film. So the cell that I want to hold a reference to, if I just switch back quickly to Excel in the sheet of data, I want to be able to keep a reference to the first column, or the cell in the first column of whichever row we're looking at. We don't need to select those cells, we can just hold a reference to it in a variable. So to make that work, switching back to the Visual Basic Editor, we can declare a variable. I'm going to call it something like current ID cell, and that will hold a reference to a range. Then we can say set current ID cell to be equal to. Then I want to make sure that I can reference the WS Films worksheet, that's its code name, so I can say wsfilms.range A2. So that's the first cell which contains the ID column heading. And I want to offset from there a number of rows down. The number of rows I want to offset down is the same as the value of the current record ID property. So at this point I'm just going to refer to the current record ID property and then offset 0 columns to the right, and that will store the correct, or store a reference to the correct row based on the current record ID. So referring to this line of code here triggers the get property statement, or the property get statement for the current record ID, which retrieves the value that we previously stored, which the very first time the form loads will be the number 1. So this line here essentially is saying the first time that we load the form, it refers to row number 1, or in fact specifically range A3 on the films worksheet. The next job is to load the values of the cells into the correct controls on the form. One technique that we could use to do this is to set the control source property of each control as we pass through the different rows. We haven't used the control source property yet in this video series. Just to very quickly show you what the control source property does, if I switch back to the Visual Basic Editor and I want to look at the form's design view, so I'm going to go back to the design view of the form, or the object view. If I select, for instance, the title text box, or the film name text box, there's a property here called control source. Now this can just be a simple reference to a specific cell. So for example, if I type in sheet 1 exclamation mark, so sheet 1 is still the actual sheet name, the tab name as it sits in Excel, rather than WS Films, exclamation mark, and then B3. If I hit enter at this point, you'll see that it loads the value of cell B3 directly into the text box. I'm just going to remove that from the properties window, and then I'll also annoyingly have to change the actual value property or text property of the text box. So the value and the text property are linked together, they contain the same value basically. So I remove the value from one, it removes it from the other. Of course we want to do that in code, so I'm going to close down the object view of the form and then go back to the code. So what we could do here is write a line which sets the control source property. So let's say film name dot control source equals, and then we know that all the data is on sheet 1, so I can say sheet 1 exclamation mark, and then I can concatenate to the end of that the address of the cell that is offset 1 column to the right from the current ID cell. So I can say current ID cell dot offset 0,1 dot address. So the address property gives me the cell reference of the cell. I can do the same sort of thing for the other controls on the form as well. So let's say, for instance, film gross dot control source equals, and then again it's going to be exactly the same thing, just we're offsetting 2 columns to the right from the current ID cell rather than just 1. And with that basic example done, let's switch back into Excel and then back onto the menu sheet, and we ought to find that when we choose Edit Films, it automatically loads in the title and the gross for Avatar. So of course we haven't done it for the remaining controls, hence why they're still set to their original values. Now, one of the useful things about the control source property is that it's linked immediately with the cell. So as soon as I start changing the value of this text box, then it will update the value in the cell itself. So I don't know, I've just read this week, James Cameron's announced that he's making another 5 films in the Avatar. He hadn't even made the second one yet. I don't know why he's announced the 5th one in the series. But anyway, let's say we were going to change Avatar to Avatar 2, for instance. That probably makes, I don't know, 10 times as much money as the first one made. And as soon as we do that, it's already updated the data in the underlying worksheet. So if I just cancel out of the form and then go back to sheet 1, we'll see that it's now Avatar 2. So as soon as you make the change when the control source is linked to a text box on the form, it updates the data in the cells immediately. So this seems like a really useful, simple way to achieve what we're trying to achieve, but there are a few downsides. First of all, the fact that the data changes immediately could be a bad thing. What if the user changes their mind partway through? If they decide to abandon all the changes they made to the film, clicking cancel has no effect. We'd have to write code that resets all of the values back to their original status if the user chooses to cancel. Secondly, it's really, really awkward to make the control source property work, for instance, for things like the genres. When we have multiple items to check in a list box, that's not going to, the control source property just does not give us a simple way to achieve that. So we're not going to use the control source property for this form to work. I'm going to cancel out of the form and then just check that I've gone back to Avatar, the original one, rather than Avatar 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever he's making next. And then if we switch back into the Visual Basic editor, and I'm going to get rid of these 2 lines of code, what we're going to do instead is just change the values or the text properties of the various controls to be equal to whatever the values of the cells are. Okay, so this isn't a particularly sophisticated approach, but it's going to work. So I'm going to say film name.value equals, and then it's going to be current ID cell dot offset 0,1 and dot value. So that hasn't linked the film name text box to the cell itself. It's just transferring the value from the cell into the text box, and then of course if we change the value in the text box on the form, we'll also have to have code that rewrites it back to the cell, but we'll deal with that a little bit later on. For now, let's just focus on getting all the values for an individual film loaded into the form in the first place. So let's say next we'll have film gross.value equals, excuse me, I'll try and type a bit better than that, and let's cheat a little bit. A bit of copying and pasting will serve as well here. So let's say that's going to be offset 2 columns across. For the film date, what I'm going to do here is set the value of the film date scroll bar, so rather than the text box itself, based on the other events that we've got attached to these 2 controls. If we modify the value of the scroll bar, it automatically updates the value in the text box, and it's the scroll bar that actually contains the date's value, so that's what we're going to use. So it's a film date scroll rather than the film date text box. So back to the code, I'm going to say film date scroll dot value equals. Now we also have to be careful to make sure that we're reading the correct value into, so that the film date scroll bar can only store a number, and currently what we've got stored in the cells in the worksheet are strings of text representing dates. Well, they're actually stored as dates, of course, but we need to make sure that we're reading this as a number into the scroll bar. So first of all, we're going to take the value out of the cell and convert it to a date, and then we're going to convert the date into the underlying number so that we can store it in the scroll bar control. So let's go back to the VB editor. So we're going to use the the clng function first of all to convert to a long, and we're converting to a long integer the converted to a date value, so the cdate function of the, I'm just going to paste in again what I copied earlier on, current ID cell dot offset 0,3 dot value, and close a couple of sets of parentheses at the end of that line, and that will correctly load in the date value. So just to give this a quick simple test at this point, go back to Excel, and then back onto the menu sheet and click Edit Films, and it looks like we've got the correct values loaded in for at least the first film currently. So I'm going to cancel the form and then back to the VB editor, and then close down the object view of the form to get back to the code. The next control that we want to change is a little bit trickier to deal with. This is going to be the drop-down list, the combo box for the film certificate. Now, although the film certificate combo box does have a value property, it's not the value property that we want to set. we want to tell the combo box or the list or the drop-down list to select a specific item from its list. So just to go back to the film details form just for the moment in the object view, we want to select a specific item in that list. Now this list is populated, of course, from a range of cells on the worksheet. So we've got a lists sheet, and I'm just going to focus on the BBFC ratings rather than get confused between the BBFC and MPAA ratings at this point. So let's just focus on the BBFC ratings. I want to be able to read the specific value or choose the correct item from that drop-down list based on its current position in the list. So from the Sheet 1 worksheet, where I have got 12A for avatar, for instance, what I want to tell the list box to do is select the item from the list whose position is equal to the third item in the list. The added complication here is that combo boxes and list boxes, their items are indexed from 0. So this will be item 0, this will be item 1, this will be item 2. The technique that we're going to use to read the position of this item is based from 1. So we're going to use the match function. You may know this already. A match function is an Excel worksheet function that tells you the position of one item in a list. So this is going to be 1, 2, 3, and we need to generate the value 2. So we're going to subtract 1 from the result. So having explained all that, it will probably make a lot more sense if we actually do it. So back to the Visual Basic Editor, and again I'm just going to close down the object view to get back to the code view of the form. What we're going to do here is say film certificate dot, and although we could say value, again that's not what we're going to do. We're going to instead say list index. So list index allows you to choose which item is selected in the list. Now we want to make that equal to the result of a worksheet function. I know for sure I'm going to run out of space horizontally to do this. I'm going to give myself a new line character, a space underscore, and then just indent one space with the tab key. And I'm going to refer to the worksheet function property and then refer to the match function from within there. Now, as ever with the worksheet functions, when you refer to them in VBA, they never give you particularly good help. The parameter lists are just arg1, arg2, arg3, etc. So what we're trying to do here is refer to the value of the cell that is 4 columns to the right of our current ID cell. We also have to be slightly careful that some of these values are stored as numbers rather than bits of text. So just to make sure we're always dealing with it with a string, that the certificates we're assigning to films aren't really numbers, even though we've got 12, 15 and 18. They're actually just really descriptive pieces of text. So we're going to convert to a string the current ID cell offset 0, 4 value, so I can quickly copy and paste that, 0, 4 dot value. That's the item I'm trying to match. The place I'm trying to find that, if I type in a comma and a space underscore, the place that I'm trying to find that is in the WS lists worksheet, range A2 to A8. So it's a fairly unsophisticated way to do this. It's a fairly constant way, but I'm going to assume that that list isn't going to change from this point on. And then finally we're going to say comma 0. The 0 there indicates that we're looking for an exact match, not a rough match. And as we said, we need to subtract 1 from the result to create the correct index number for the combo box. This is one that we should probably just give a quick test to make sure that we've got it right. So if I switch back into Excel and then quickly check on the Sheet 1 worksheet what type of film we're looking at, so it's a 12A film, and then if I switch back to the menu sheet and display the edit films, or click the edit films button, I should find that the film has been loaded as 12A. So that's quite important. It's not just enter the value 12A into the combo box, it's actually selected that item by setting the list index property. So that's all working. It's a bit more complicated, of course, than the previous examples, but certainly achievable. So that's how that one works. Let's carry on and set a few more controls and values then on the form. The next few are relatively simple. Let's say film runtime dot value. So this refers to the spin button on the form. That's the one that holds the film's runtime value. That's nice and easy. That's just again offset a certain number of columns across. So in this case it's offset 7 columns for the runtime. I'm just skipping over a couple of columns by the way at this point. Then we've got the film scene checkbox, so I can say film scene dot value equals, and again I'm just going to paste in, and this is the value of the cell that's 8 columns across. So they will set, if I just switch back to the object view, that will set the value of the spin button, keeps the film's runtime value stored, and the scene it checkbox has the value true or false. So again, linking back to Excel, these values look like these simple numbers, and the CNIT value contains either true or false. So we've skipped over the suitable for column and the genre column. We're going to this is the most complicated one of the lot, I think. We're going to deal with this completely separately. So we'll just focus on the simple ones for now. So again, just very quickly checking edit films, and we've got the CNIT checkbox checked and the correct runtime there loaded in as well. Next one is to change the or read the any good checkbox value. We haven't done that one yet. This one's a little more complex again because we've got 3 possible values for this. The checkbox itself can hold true, false or null. But when we wrote the data out into the worksheet, we converted null values into the literal string unknown. So now we need to do the reverse. So back into the Visual Basic Editor, and again close down the form to get back to the code view, and we need to have a new line here which checks what value is currently stored in the cell that's 9 columns across. So the name of the checkbox was called film good, as in is the film any good, and we want to set its value property. We're going to make this equal to not just the value of the cell that's 9 columns across. We need to check if. So we're going to use the if function rather than an if statement. So IIF, open a set of parentheses, and then we're going to check if the current ID cell offset 0,9 dot value is equal to the words unknown. And if that's true, what we would like to do is pass the value null, or set the value of the checkbox to the value null. So you write out just the word null explicitly in your code. And then another comma, so if the value is not unknown, then I just want to pass in the value of that cell. So again, if I just paste in what I've previously copied, and then change the offset to 9 columns across, and then change the, I'll add the parentheses to the end, just to make it a little bit more readable. I'll use the space underscore, and it looks like I've got a few other ones to do here as well, so let's just add in one more just to split that across, so you can read the whole thing in one screen width. Okay, again, a couple more simple ones to keep us going. So the film picture path, which I can set quite easily. I can say film picture path dot value is equal to the cell that's offset 10 columns across. So again, just pasting in, that's 10 columns across. And then the film trailer URL, that's also quite easy to set. So film trailer URL dot value equals, and paste in again, and that's the value of the cell that's 11 columns across. The next kind of sticking point is to set the film's original trailer URL. So if I just switch back into Excel briefly and then launch the form, so just check that we've got all these values read in. So we've got the picture path loaded in there as well. We've got the any good checkbox checked or unchecked or nulled, depending on what the actual value is. Then the trailer page. So we've got the constructed trailer URL. What we'd also like to be able to do is put back in the original YouTube URL, or at least a simulated version of the original URL. Again, this all comes from an earlier video in the series, the previous video in this series, in fact, about using YouTube videos in forms. So basically what I'd like to do is do the reverse translation that we did in the previous video. So take this one back to its original basic URL. So let's cancel out of the form, and then we're going to head back to the VB editor, and what we'll do is we'll create a function that will help us to calculate the original film's URL. We'll declare a private function then, and I'll add this in just below the read film details procedure. So let's say private function, and I'm going to call this one original URL, and it's going to accept a single parameter which I'm going to call trailer URL as a string, and it's going to return a string as well, so as string at the end. Just to remind ourselves what we're actually dealing with here, what we're trying to do, I want to create a copy of the URL that we've calculated. So if I switch back into Excel and head on to sheet 1, and then I'm just going to select and copy that URL and then paste it back into my VB editor. So I'll paste that in as a quick comment, and then I also want to create or grab a copy of the URL that we're trying to construct as well. So I've just very quickly headed into YouTube and got the same original trailers URL. That's the sort of thing we're trying to construct. So I can do that, and I can head back to the VB editor and then just paste that in as well. So knowing that, we can now start to work out what it is exactly we're trying to do. Basically speaking, the main important part of this entire URL is just the code for the video that we're trying to display. The rest of it we can construct fairly easily. We know that every single URL we want to generate has these characters at the start of it, so all we really need to do is extract the video's ID. Let's start by declaring a couple of simple variables. I'm going to say dim start of ID as integer, and then I'm going to say dim length of ID as integer as well. We don't really need these variables, it just makes it easier to break the steps down into smaller, more manageable chunks. Then we'll finally say dim video ID as string, so that will just hold the string of text. It's quite possible that when the user first added this film to our list that they didn't include a URL for the film. There may not have been a trailer to display. So we're going to make sure that if the trailer URL is an empty string, then we don't try to calculate anything. So we're going to start with a quick if statement that's going to say if trailer URL equals an empty string, then just exit the function. And having done that, we start to calculate the various important parts of this URL. So the first thing to do is try to find basically where the video's ID begins and store the result in the start of ID variable. So that, I guess one way we could do this is use this sequence of characters, a forward slash, a v, and a forward slash. That's fairly unique to this entire URL. If we can establish where that is stored, then we know that we can find exactly the video's ID from that point on. We may well want to rely on the fact that every video's URL starts with that exact sequence of characters, but we can't guarantee that that will always be the same. Perhaps we might have HTTP rather than HTTPS, for instance, so we can't always guarantee the number of characters is going to be exactly the same. So we'll do this based on trying to find that sequence of characters. So we're going to say start of ID equals, then we're going to use the inString function, instr, and we're going to start at character position number 1, and the string that we're looking in is the trailer URL, and the string that we're looking for is a forward slash, a v, and a forward slash. Now we want to find the character position that is from the start of that place. It's 1, 2, 3 characters in front of that, or ahead of that, so let's say +3 to take us to the actual start of the video's ID. The next thing we need to do is establish how long the video's ID is. Now again, it may be possible that this ID number is a set number of characters, so every video ID has the same number of characters in its identifier, but we can't guarantee that. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to look for the start. Well, we're going to look for the end of the video's ID, which is effectively the start of the URL's parameters, which is indicated with a question mark. So what we're going to do here is say length of ID equals, and again it's going to be in string, 1 trailer URL, but this time we're not going to be looking for the /v/ characters, we're going to be looking for the question mark character instead. And once we've found the position of that, we can subtract the start of ID position, and that will give us the length of the video's ID. Finally, what we can do is extract the video ID itself by using the mid function. So we can say video ID equals mid, and then the string that we're looking inside is the trailer URL, and we're going to start at the character position that's equivalent to the start of ID, and the number of characters we're going to get from there is equivalent to the length of ID. So at that point we've got the video's ID. The very last step of the entire function then is to return the original URL. So we're going to say original URL equals, then we know the start of it is always going to be the same. It's HTTP. Why am I typing this out? I can just copy and paste this part. So we can just copy and paste that part there, and then wrap that up in a set of double quotes, and then finally concatenate the video ID to the end. So that will generate the original URL, and now that we've done that, we can just scroll back up here a little bit, and we've got another control whose value we're going to set. So we're going to say film trailer original URL dot value equals, then we're going to call the original URL function, and we're going to pass into it the current constructed URL. So I can just copy and paste that, current ID cell offset 0,11 dot value. Having done all that, we should just give this one a quick little test. Let's switch back to Excel and then back to the menu sheet and click Edit Films, and we ought to find that if we head to the Trailer tab that we've got the URL pasted in. So that's the same sequence, the same video ID, and in fact if I were to choose to update the trailer, it should, depending on how quickly this will load, launch the avatar trailer. So there we go. Okay, so there's really just one more value to read into the form at this point, the genres, and sadly this is the most complicated part of the entire read procedure. We've got to be able to check each of the boxes for any genre that the film belongs to. So if I just cancel out of the form, the reason this is so difficult is because what we did when we generated the data to pass into the worksheet is we generated a comma-separated string. So we can't just read that directly into the list box. What we have to do is process this string in some way. So we need to identify each individual item in there, in the comma-separated list, and match that against one of the potential checkboxes in the list box. And if it is matching the genre that's selected, then we need to check the box, otherwise we need to uncheck it. And that's quite a complicated procedure. So let's just switch back into the Visual Basic Editor, and we're going to do a similar thing. We're going to break this down into a separate procedure altogether, and in fact I'm going to write this sort of in between the read film details and the function we've just declared. So just below there we're going to create a new private sub this time, so it's not going to return a value, it's just going to produce carry out a set of instructions. So I'm going to call this one read genres. If I can spell genres, that would help. And then I want to pass in a value to a single parameter. So I want to pass in just the genre list for this procedure. So genre list as string. When I call this one, then what I want to be able to do is, in fact, let's just go back to the previous procedure, the one where we're reading all the film details. And what I'd like to be able to do is say call read genres, and I need to pass into it the value of the cell that is just 6 columns to the right, I believe. So let's just copy and paste that, and then update the offset to 6, make sure we close the parentheses. So that will pass in the comma-separated string into this procedure. Now we have to process it. The simplest way I think to do this is to take the full comma-separated string and convert it into an array of individual values. So let's start by declaring an array. I'm going to say dim genres as string, and then the simplest way by far, I only learned this actually quite recently, pointed out by somebody watching one of the videos in fact. So the simplest way to do this is to use a built-in function. I'm going to say genres is equal to this result of the split function. So the split function allows you to take a string of text, specify the delimiter for that, and each of the individual items will automatically be loaded into the array. So genres equals split. The array, the string that I want to split is genre list, and the delimiter that I want to detect is a comma. So having done that, at that point we've got an array populated with every individual genre. So it's a dynamic array. It will size itself automatically to the number of items that we've returned. That's by far and away the simplest way to do it. The next step is to compare the items in our array with the items in the list box. And where there's a match, we need to check the box. Where there's no match, we need to uncheck the box. So this may well not be the most efficient way to do it, but it is a way that certainly works, and hopefully is relatively easy to understand. Feel free to make improvements to your heart's content, but this is the way that I'm going to approach it. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, declare a variable which allows us to loop through the list items in the list box. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to loop through it using a counter variable. So I'm going to say dim I as integer, and the basic loop that allows me to loop through the list items using this counter variable is a for next loop. Again, we've created a video on arrays that's part of the main Excel VBA tutorial series, so you may well find that one useful if you're not familiar with working with arrays. If you are, well, I'll teach you just enough here to get the system to work, of course, and then there's a lot more research you can do for yourself later on. So to start with, let's say for I equals. Then I want to go from the lowest bound item of the array, so I'm going to use the lbound function, and then I'm going to refer to the film genres list property, so film genres.list, and I want to carry on looping through to the upper bound item, or the upper bound element of the film genres .list. I'll get there eventually. .list, there we go. And then to move on to the next iteration of the loop, or the next counter of the loop, next I. Now within this loop, I want to loop over all of the items in the array that we've just created. So I'm going to do this in a slightly different way. Rather than using another counter variable, I'm going to show you how to use a for each loop to loop through the items in an array. So to do that, we need to declare a variant variable. So I'm going to say something like dim g as variant, and then inside the loop we've just created, we can say for each g in genres. For each loops, I don't know if you agree with me, for each loops are much nicer and easier to use than old school and basic for next loops. So for each g in genres, and then we're going to say next g, And then inside this loop, what we want to do is compare the value of the G variable with the item that we're currently looking at in the film genres list. So we're going to have an if statement here that's going to say if film genres list, and then we want to refer specifically to the item whose number equals the value of our counter variable. So for if film genres.list I is equal to G, then we're going to do something. So I'm just going to give myself a couple of blank lines and then say end if. What we want to try to do here is establish that if this condition is true, then we have found a match for that particular genre. And to keep track of that, what we're going to do is have another variable, a Boolean variable, called dim genre match, something along those lines, as Boolean. And then if we establish that we found a match, we're going to say genre match, beg your pardon, genre match rather than genre list, genre match equals true. Because we're looping through this multiple times, we want to make sure that each time we're checking a new genre that it was originally set to false. So I'm going to copy and paste that line, and just each time we begin the loop again, we're going to make sure that we say genre match equals false. Okay, so once we've reached the end of looping through every combination of list item and genre in our list, we can then determine whether or not that specific box should be checked. So we need to test if genre match. So if we have found a match, then what we want to do is set the item we're looking at to be selected. So this time we're going to refer to film genres dot selected. So selected is another array. List boxes have got two separate arrays. The list array contains a list of the actual values, and the selected array contains the same number of elements, but with basically the true false values to determine whether they've been selected or not. So this is for a multi-value list box, two separate arrays containing the same number of items, one with the actual values and one with the true false values to determine whether they've been selected or not. So I'm going to refer to the same item, so we're on the same counter variable, so for I, so the same value of I, and then I'm simply going to make it to be equal to true. So if we've established a match, then it's true. We also need to make sure that we set it to false if we haven't. This is because later on in the video we're going to be stepping through. We're going to be able to load the next record in the list. We want to make sure that we uncheck the previously checked ones for each new film that we encounter. So in this case, we're going to set the film genre selected to be equal to false, and then end if. And that's the entirety of that loop. So we've got this plugged in already to our main procedure. All we should need to do is give this one a quick test. If we switch back into Excel then, and just a quick check for the film we're about to load, Avatar, that's action, adventure and science fiction. So if we switch onto the menu sheet and click the Edit Films button, head onto the Genres tab, and we ought to find that we get those three checkboxes checked. I guess we'll only see if this really works when we get to the stage where we're navigating through the different records. So we should see that if we move to the next record, these three get unchecked, and the correct genres for the film we move on to get checked instead. So I guess that's the next step. We're going to start by creating some navigation buttons down in the bottom right hand corner of the form that we can click on to move between the different records in our list. We'll get started by drawing some navigation controls on the form. So let's cancel out of it and then head back to the Visual Basic editor. And in the design view of the form, or the object view of the form, we'll just make it a little bit wider so we get a bit more space. We're going to draw a new frame at the bottom right hand corner. So we'll draw this outside of the existing multi-page control so it's always visible on the form. So let's start with the frame itself. We'll draw that somewhere towards the bottom right hand corner, and then I'll change its name and a couple of its basic properties. So its name can be called Record Navigation Frame. It's worthwhile drawing everything in a frame. This makes it easier to hide all of the navigation controls when the form is in add mode. So we'll call this Record Navigation Frame, and then I'll change its caption so that it's called something like Record Navigation. The buttons that I'm going to draw inside the frame are going to look pretty similar to the ones we've already drawn on the form to navigate between the pages of the multi-page control. So rather than draw these out again from scratch, I'm just going to copy one of them by pressing Ctrl+C, having selected it, and then click into the navigation frame and press Ctrl+V 4 times. That'll give me 4 separate copies of that button. I'll arrange them roughly in a straight line for the time being. We can spend a bit more time tidying them up a little bit later on. And then the important thing is that we give them more sensible, unique names. So the first button on there, I'm going to change its name so that it's called Navigate to First Record. Navigate to First Record. and then the caption of that, I'm just going to make it equal to a vertical bar and an opened angle bracket, so it looks like it's navigating to the first record, I guess. Similar to the way Microsoft Access indicates navigating to the first record, I guess. The next one along, this is going to be called navigate to previous record. I'm trying to keep the names fairly consistent with these buttons so that all their event procedures appear together in the code page of the form. So the next one is going to be navigate to next record. Navigate to next record. And then the last one of all, if I just change the caption of that one first, sorry, beg pardon, let's change that to a closed angle bracket. Then the last one will be called navigate to last record. And we'll change its caption as well in a moment, just so it's a closed angle bracket and then a vertical bar. So 4 simple buttons that will navigate between the different records in our list. Now the code that we want to execute when any of these 4 buttons is clicked is going to be pretty similar. Really the only difference is in which direction we're moving and exactly how many records we're moving. So rather than write out a complete separate procedure for each button's click event, we're going to write a generic procedure that can be called by each of these 4 buttons. So let's just start by generating the click event handler for the navigate to first record button. And then while we're here, we can declare another private subroutine that's going to be called by the one we just generated. So I'm going to call this one private sub navigate to record. So just generically any record can be navigated to by this procedure. What we would like to be able to do is each time one of the 4 buttons is clicked, I'd like to be able to call this subroutine, but also pass a value into a single parameter which determines exactly which record we're trying to go to. Now we could do that using a string of text or a simple number, but as we've seen earlier on, it makes life much easier if we have enumerations that describe the values we're passing into different procedures. So let's head back up to the top of the code page for the form, and we'll declare another enumeration. So previously this was public because it needed to be used outside of the form. This enumeration is going to be used only inside the form, so we can declare it as a private enum, and we'll call this something along the lines of navigation, or tell you what, let's call it something like record navigation, if I can spell that properly, record navigation directions. So it's quite a long-winded one, but there we go. We'll say end enum, and then we can declare 4 separate constants inside this enumeration. So let's call the first one something like record first, and then the second one will be record last, and the third one will be record previous, and last of all we'll have record next. We're not assigning values to these constants explicitly as we did in the previous example. The numbers aren't really important. They'll be indexes from 0, so that'll be 0, 1, 2 and 3, but those values aren't really that important. We're just interested in the actual text. So what we can now do, now that we've got this enumeration declared, if I scroll back down to the navigate click event handler, so I choose one of my navigation buttons, navigate to first record for instance, and then we can declare a parameter for the navigate to record procedure. That's going to say something like record to go to, something along those lines, as navigation, sorry, beg pardon, record navigation directions. So there's our enumeration in the IntelliSense list. So what we can now do, whenever we click on one of those 4 buttons, we can simply say call navigate to record, and then in a set of parentheses we can say exactly which record we're going to go to. So navigate to first record, of course, we want to go to record first. All we have to do now is make sure that we write all the code inside this procedure that will go to the correct position. We should add a little bit of validation to the navigate to record procedure to make sure that, for instance, we don't navigate to a new record if the user hasn't filled everything in on the form. So we already have a function that we created in an earlier video in the series when we were talking about form validation that checks that everything's been filled in. So we're going to write a quick simple logical test here. If not everything filled in, which is the function we've previously declared, then exit sub. So we don't go to a new record if the user hasn't filled in everything that's required. Next, we need to check exactly which record it is we're trying to go to, and we can do that by testing which value's been passed in by this parameter. We can do this using either a select case statement or an if statement. We'll get a little bit more help if we use an if statement here. We'll see the values of the enumeration that we're using. So I'm going to use an if statement to do this. Let's just fill in the outline of the if statement first of all. I'm going to say, first of all, if record to go to equals record first, then I want to have an else if statement essentially that does exactly the same thing but testing for one of the other values of the parameters. Let's just copy and paste that and tag on the word else to the start to make that into an else if, and here we'll test not record first, we'll remove that and test for record last instead, and then again we can just copy and paste that line and we'll paste it in a couple more times. So let's have it there and there. We'll test for not record last, we'll test for record next, and again not record last, we'll test for record previous. So that's the basic skeleton outline of that if statement done. We'll fill in the end if, and then just to sort of tie up the whole thing, once we've finished determining which record to go to, we're simply going to say call read film details. So that will read the film details based on whatever the current record ID is. So our job inside the if statement here is to work out what the current record ID should be. Probably the easiest one to determine is if we're trying to go to the first record. We know that the record ID for the first record is simply equal to the number 1. So in this part of the if statement we can simply say current record ID equals 1. Going to the last record is a little bit trickier. What we need to do to make this work is to essentially calculate how many records we've got in our list. This is something we're likely to want to do a few times, both in this video and in a later one in the series. So what we're going to do is create a property that will always retrieve the current number of records or the current record count for our entire list. So let's head back up to the top of the code page where we put our other properties earlier on. This property is going to be ever so slightly different. Previously we've created two read-write properties, so we had both a get and a let property statement for the two properties we've created so far. What we want to do here is create a read-only property, so it's one whose value we can't set, only one whose value we can read or retrieve. So it's fairly simple to create a read-only property. All you need to do is only write the get part of the property statements. So let's create a private property, get. I'm going to call this one record count, and I'm going to return its result as long. And then all we need to do in here is say a record count equals, and then I want to simply count how many rows are populated in the films worksheet. So I'm going to say wsfilms.range A3, which is the first cell which contains a film ID, and then a comma, and then I want to say wsfilms.range. I've got a variety of ways I could do this. I could go from the top of the list downwards to find the last populated cell in column A, or I could also go from the bottom of the worksheet upwards to do the same thing. The advantage of going from the bottom of the worksheet upwards is that if there were any gaps in the list, if there were any blank cells, going from the bottom of the sheet upwards will ignore the blank cells basically. So I'm going to say range A48576 dot end XL up. Try that again, XL up, and then from there we want to say how many rows are there, so we'll refer to the rows property and then simply count the rows. So that returns the number of, essentially the number of film IDs that we've currently got in our list, assuming that it's a continuous list with no gaps in it. So having done that, I'm just going to get back down to the navigation section, so I'll use the drop down list at the top left to do that. So we'll say we'll go to the navigate to first record click event, and then all we're going to do here in the else if part of the statement where we're going checking for record last is we're going to set current record ID, sorry spell that properly, current record ID equals record count. The other two are relatively straightforward. Then if we're going to the next record, then we're going to say current record ID equals current record ID plus 1. So it increases by 1, and then that makes it fairly obvious what we're going to do for the record previous. We're going to say current record ID equals current record ID minus 1 instead. Okay, what we have to do next then is hook up this subroutine to the click events of the other three buttons. So we've got navigate to first record done already. Let's have a quick look at the other three buttons. So we've got navigate to last record. Let's just choose that one to generate the click event procedure for that. And again, all we're going to do is call on this same procedure. I'm just going to copy and paste the call statement from the previous subroutine that we put this one into, and instead of saying record first, we're going to say record last instead. Exactly the same idea for the other two buttons. So we've got navigate to next record, and again I'm just going to paste in the exact same procedure call, but instead of saying record first, we're going to say record next this time. And then one more button to go, we've got to get to navigate to previous record, and again I'm just going to paste in the exact same procedure call and change record first to record previous. One last thing we should do before we test the system out is make sure that the user can't go to an invalid record. So for instance, if we try to navigate to a previous record and we're already on the first one, then we shouldn't be allowed to proceed. So let's add a little bit of validation to each of the click events. We're going to check, if we click the go to or navigate to previous record button, we should first of all check that the current record ID is not less than or equal to 1. It shouldn't actually be possible for that to be less than 1 anyway, but if we're already on the first record, then we certainly shouldn't be allowed to go to a previous one. So if that is the case, then exit sub before we attempt to do anything. In a similar way, we need to check that if we try to navigate to the next record and we're already on the last one. So if current record ID is again greater than or equal to the record count. So here we are using the property that we just created again. Again, it shouldn't be possible for the record ID to be greater than the record count, but again, just in case, then we're going to say exit sub. I guess we could do the same thing. It won't really actually make any difference. If we try to navigate to the last record and navigate to the first record, then it won't really make any difference if we try to do that again. But just to avoid running more code than is absolutely necessary, we should do essentially the same thing for the navigate to last and first. So for the navigate to last record, if we're already on the last record, then there's no point navigating to it again. And likewise, if we were already on the first record, then there's no point navigating to the first record again. So let's just copy and paste that if statement there. Okay, so with all the validation in place, we should now be in a position to give this entire system a quick test. There is actually one final issue to solve before we can test the system, and it's related to how we're setting the value for our film certificate combo box. If I just scroll back up to the top of the code page again and get to the read film details procedure, you may remember from earlier on we used the match function to retrieve the value from the worksheet and match that against the items stored in the lists on the lists sheet. So this has worked fine so far. If I just switch back into Excel, the first film that we're retrieving a value for, if I look at sheet 1, Avatar has a certificate of 12A. So this is text, although it's got numbers in it. The actual value stored in the cell is clearly text because of the capital letter A there. The next film is Titanic, which has a certificate of 12. And there's a small issue with the match function working with numbers and text. We're trying to match the value against the number 12 in this list. And this is going to cause a runtime error when we try to execute it. Feel free to try this at this point. All we're going to do here, just to make sure that we're matching the correct values, is we're going to actually store these properly as text. Although they're formatted as text, the values stored in the cells are still just numbers. So the simplest way to make sure that these are actually stored as actual strings of text is to type an apostrophe, a single quote, in front of the number. And we need to do that for each of the numeric values in the list. So for 15 and 18 films as well, we need to make sure that those are actually stored as text. We'll get little warnings saying that this is a number stored as text, but that's exactly what we want, so that's fine. You can tell it to ignore the error if you really wanted to. In fact, you can select all 3 cells and use a little icon here to ignore this error. But the important thing is that we have this little apostrophe indicating that it's stored as actual text. So, having done all that, we can now go to the menu worksheet and click on the Edit Films button, and that will retrieve the value for Avatar correctly. And if I do click on the next button, that will retrieve the value for Titanic, and so on and so on. We should check that it's changing the genres as well, so if I just sort of navigate between the different genres, making sure that it's setting the correct ones. So we see that it's unchecking the unrelated ones and checking the ones that are selected. And then we should be able to navigate to the last record quickly as well, and to the first record. If I'm on the first record, I can't navigate to a previous one. If I'm on the last record, I can't navigate to the next one. So our buttons are working. We can read the values of any film now into the form quite happily, just by navigating through them, clicking on these buttons. This system works quite well for the small number of records we have in our list currently, but if you have hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of records, navigating one by one using these buttons is quite tedious. So what we're going to do is create a separate way for the user to jump to a specific record, assuming we know what its ID number is, or what its position is in the list. So to do that, let's cancel the form first of all, and let's go back to this design view in the Visual Basic Editor. And then we're going to add a couple of extra controls just in the record navigation section. So I'm just going to move these buttons across a little bit. We're going to have a text box which both displays and allows the user to change the current record ID. And then we're also going to have a little label that describes to the user how many records there are in total. So let's draw the text box first of all. I'm just going to draw that next door to the buttons and make that a little bit shorter. And then we're going to change its name, so this is called record number. Then next door to that I'm going to draw a label which is going to be called record number label. Just give myself a little bit of space. So the label will be drawn right next door to the text box, and again make it a little bit shorter or narrower, and then we're going to call this one record number label. So let's just modify its name, so it's called record number label. To begin with, all I want is for the text box to reflect the current record ID whenever that value changes. So if we switch back to the code view of the form, we know that we can detect when the current record ID value changes because we created our property statements earlier on. We've got both a let and a get property statement for the current record ID. So we know that the let procedure is triggered whenever we change the value of the current record ID. So we just need to add a couple of simple lines of code in here that are going to say things like record number dot value equals whatever value gets passed in to the property when we're changing it. So we just refer to the value parameter again. And we can also say record number label. And we want to change its caption to make that equal to the word of, followed by an ampersand, and then I want to read the current record count. So that will tell us how many records there currently are. So having done that, we can switch back into Excel and then launch the form using the Edit Films button, and we'll see that it loads initially. We could do a little bit of tidying up in terms of alignment, but anyway, we've got 1 of 6, and if I navigate through, 2 of 6, and so on, and so on, and so on. The next step is to make it so that the user can type in a number here and for the form to navigate to that record immediately. And again, we'll have to add in some validation code to make sure the user doesn't type in an invalid number, but we can make that work once again by heading back to the Visual Basic Editor. So we can close down the form and head back to the VB editor again. There's a variety of events we could choose to make this system work, but for this example we're going to use the before update event of the text box. So the simplest way to get there is to double click on the text box first. That gives us the event handler for the change event. Then we can use the drop down list in the top right hand corner and choose before update instead. Then let's just delete the change event handler. We want to make sure that we only navigate to a record that the user has typed in if they've typed in a valid number. So first of all, let's add a quick if statement that checks if is numeric, and then we can pass into that the value of that text box. So we can say record number.textbox, record number.value. Then, if that condition is met, we want to make sure that the number is between 1 and the record count. So we'll add another if statement that's going to check if record number.value is both greater than or equal to 1, and record number.value is less than or equal to the record count. So we can rely on our record count property there. If those conditions are true, or if all those conditions have been met, let's just fill in the end if statements, and then so on, then what we're going to do is we're going to call the navigate to record procedure that we created earlier on. So we're going to say call navigate to record. If I can find it, there it is. And then we've got to say which record it is we're trying to navigate to. We want to use the enumeration that we created earlier on, but we haven't actually got a constant in there that relates to specifying an exact record. So before we can do this, let's just close the parentheses. Let's just fill in a placeholder record first for the moment, and then scroll back up to the top of the code page, and we'll add an extra item to our enumerations. We'll say record, let's call it record specific or record specified. And then what we can do is scroll back down again. So let's just use the list of items, a list of objects, so we can choose record number. That takes us straight back down to the correct place. Then we can get rid of the placeholder record first and instead refer to record specified. What we then need to do is make sure that when we navigate to the record, so the simplest way to get here is to right click on navigate to record and choose definition. That will take us back to the start of that procedure, and then we can add in another else if statement. So we can say else if record to go to equals record specified. Then all we're going to do is set the current record ID to be equal to record number value. Okay, so that should achieve the correct result. All we need to do now is give this one a quick little test. So again, let's switch back into Excel, and then we can show the form by clicking the Edit Films button. And if we just type in a number here, we should be able to type in, for instance, the number 3. This is triggered by the before update event, so in order to make this work, we have to navigate away from the text box. If I just hit the Tab key to navigate away, we'll get to record number 3. And if I do that again, try to type in record number 6 and hit Tab, we'll get to the 6th record, type in number 1 and tab away again, we'll get back to the first one. If I type in an invalid number, like -1 for instance, nothing happens. If I type in an obviously large number, like 123, nothing happens. If I type in any text, again, nothing will happen. So we can only navigate to a record if we do type in a valid number. So that gives the user a quick, simple way now to get to any record whose number they know. This system certainly improves the way the user can navigate to records, but they still need to rely on knowing what number the record has. So it might be even better if we could create some kind of way for the user to search for records. So what we're going to do is create a new text box where the user can type in a partial name of a film, and then when they can find the next or find the previous record matching the text typed in by clicking a couple of buttons. So let's do that by cancelling out of the form first of all, and then we can switch back to the Visual Basic editor, and we're going to draw another text box into the same little record navigation section. I'm just going to draw it just below the current navigation buttons. I'm going to change the name of this button so that it's, the name of this text box so that it's called something like record search text. So record search text. And then we'll have a couple of buttons that will navigate to the previous and next record matching the text that the user has typed in. So I'm going to just again copy a button and then paste it, and then do exactly the same thing, paste it again, and move it to the other side of the text box. So the first button on the left-hand side, I'm going to call this Find Previous Record. And then the one on the right-hand side, I'm going to change its name so that it's called Find Next Record. I'll also change the caption of this one so that it's pointing to the right, so the closed angle bracket symbol. Now let's add some code to the click event of the Find Next button. So I'm going to double click on that, and then we'll start by adding a bit of validation code. We don't want to do anything unless the user has typed something into the text box. So we can say if record search text dot value equals an empty string, then exit sub. What I then want to do is try to find the next cell containing the film name that the user searched for, or the partial film name. And I'm going to try to store the result of that in a variable. So what I'm going to do first of all up at the top is declare a range variable, which I'll call simply r as range. And then having established we've typed something in at least, we're going to set r to be equal to the result of the find method. Now I want to apply the find method to a range of cells on the films worksheet. So wsFilms dot range, and the top cell in the list containing a film name is range B3. The bottom cell in the list containing a film name will be, again, from wsFilms.range. And again, we could go from the top to the bottom of the list. Here we're going to go from the bottom of the worksheet upwards. And we'll say B1048576 dot end, open some parentheses, XL up. And then we can say dot find, open some parentheses. Now there's a whole range of parameters to fill in here, so lots of arguments to pass in. So I'm going to put these onto different lines. I'm going to press type in a space and then an underscore, and then the first parameter that I'll fill in will be the what parameter. The thing that I'm trying to find is whatever the user typed in to the record search text box. So I'm going to say record search text dot value, then a comma, space underscore. The next thing I'm going to specify is the after parameter. So the after parameter lets me choose which cell to begin searching after. Otherwise it would just continue searching, or start searching from the very top of the range each time. So assuming that we're going to search for a different film each time, we want to carry on finding the next one and the next one and the next one and so on, we need to make sure that we're searching after the one that we're currently looking at. One way that we could use to do this is to refer to the current ID cell. So that's a variable that we declared in a previous procedure in this video. In the read film details procedure right up at the top here, we declared a variable current ID cell which stored whichever row, essentially a reference to the cell that we're currently looking at in column A. This is currently a variable that's declared within the read film details procedure. So what we're going to do, just to make our life a little bit easier, is we're going to cut that from there, and we're going to declare it at the top of the code page. So somewhere up here, along with all of our other variables that are declared at the form level. And again, rather than creating or calling this dim current ID cell, I'm going to say private current ID cell. That actually makes no difference to the scope of the variable. It's just used to indicate that this is meant to be related to the form rather than accessible outside of the form. So private current ID cell. What I then want to do is go back to the find next record button to click event, somewhere in here, find next record, there it is. I can say after current ID cell. Current ID cell refers to a cell in column A, and I'm trying to search in column B here, so I can say current ID cell dot offset 0,1. Okay, a couple more parameters to fill in. I'm going to say look at next. Look at allows you to specify whether you're looking or trying to match whole cell contents or just parts of cell contents, partial cell contents. By default it will be XL part, but if that had been changed, then I want to make sure that that's reset to look at only partial matches, so only parts of cell contents, not the entire cell contents. Then another comma, space underscore. The search direction, if I'm trying to find the next record, then of course the search direction, I want to make sure that's XL next. So let's say search direction equals XL next. And I also want to make sure, finally, that I'm not matching case, so it's not a case-sensitive search. So let's have another comma, space underscore, and then we're going to say match case equals false. And then close the parentheses, and at that point we will either have a reference to a cell in which the film name has been found, or we'll have nothing stored in the range variable. Just spotted a small mistake in the range that I've referenced there. You probably spotted that one before me, but that should be 48,000 rather than 49,000. 49,000 doesn't exist. Okay, so at this point we've got nothing. We've either got a reference to a range or nothing stored in the R variable. If there's nothing stored there, then we don't want to do anything. So if R is nothing, then exit sub. If we have found a cell, then we want to try to navigate to that record. So again, it's going to be a call to the navigate to record procedure. So we're going to say call and then navigate to a record. Okay, now again we need to be able to pass in which record we're trying to go to, and we don't have a value in the enumeration yet that allows us to specify a record found or a found record. So let's head back up to the top of the code page and let's choose to add in a new item to the enumeration. We'll call this one record found. So we'll navigate to whichever record has been found. Then we can scroll back down to the find next record. I should have just used the list at the top to do this, but anyway, well, it shouldn't take too long to get back there. There we go. Nicely highlighted in red for us there. So call navigate to record, and we're going to go to the record found item. We've also got to be able to specify, in order for this one to work, again remember that the navigate to record routine essentially sets the current record ID. Now the current record ID is basically whichever row number the R variable is currently referring to. -2, of course, because the cells or the list of films starts in row number 3 on the worksheet. If I just switch back to Excel quickly and have a look at the sheet 1. So it's whichever row number we found, -2 because we've got a blank row and the row headings or the column headings in the second row. So back in the VBA editor, we've got a couple of ways we could do this. A simple way would be to take the same approach we've just done for the current ID cell. Make this R variable public to the form, so extend its scope so that the navigate to record procedure can access it as well. Alternatively, what we could do is declare another parameter for the navigate to record procedure. So let's take that approach. Let's right-click navigate to record, choose definition, and then if we add another comma at the end of the current parameter list, we want to make this one an optional parameter. We don't always want to pass a value into it, and we'll call this one something like record row as long. Having done that, what we can do is go back to the find next record procedure, somewhere in here, find next record, and then we can type in a comma, and the record row or the row number that we want to pass in is equal to the row number that the R variable points to, so r.row -2. Phew, okay, so a little bit more complicated. The last thing we've got to do then, if I go back to the navigate to record procedure and choose its definition again, we've got to add in one more else if statement to the slightly large if statement at this point, so else if record to go to equals record found, then current record ID equals record row, so whatever value we've just passed in by the record row parameter. Phew, so as I say, slightly convoluted at this point, but the whole system should work. Let's give it a quick test. So we can switch back into Excel one more time, back to the menu sheet and click the Edit Films button. So we should find now, if we type in a search phrase and click the Find Next Record button, let's type in WA and then click the Next Record button. So that finds the first film that's got the letters WA. In any case, it's actually got it in twice, hasn't it? Star Wars The Force Awakens. If I click Next Record again, that should find any other films with those letters in them. There aren't any. So let's just try changing it to just the letter W and try clicking the next button, so we find Jurassic World. If I click Next again, it goes back to Star Wars The Force Awakens. So this will just cycle round, as it will cycle through all the records, so once it reaches the end it just cycles back to the top and finds the next one again. That's fine, I'm happy with that one working the way that it does. I was having letter S, and let's see what else we've got. So we've got the Avengers with an S, Star Wars with an S, Jurassic World with an S, and so on. So that one's working reasonably well. All we should do now, I suppose, is make the previous record button work. So that's just going to do essentially exactly the same thing, just by searching in the opposite direction. So let's cancel out of the form and then head back to the Visual Basic Editor. And I'm going to double click the Find Previous Record button and to generate the click event handler for that. And then let's just update the code for this event to make it find the records again. So all we really need to do here is copy and paste everything from the previous procedure. We perhaps could have done this slightly more efficiently, but anyway, for now we'll just copy and paste, and basically we just need to change which direction we're searching in. So rather than XL next, we're going to go for XL previous instead. Everything else is the same. We still need to check that we've typed a value in and we're searching the same range of cells for the same piece of information. So this just lets us now navigate in the opposite direction. So back into Excel, give this one little test. Let's type in a single letter, the letter S again, so I can search forwards for the next film and backwards for the previous one. So there we go. Our simple little search system all working. So now we've got to the point where we can allow the user to navigate around the record system. The last major step is to make sure that if we make a modification to one of the values, that modification gets written back out to the worksheet. So the way that we're going to make this work is that if we've navigated to a record and made a change, as soon as we try to navigate to a different record, we're then going to update the details in the existing page. So let's start by closing the form down and then heading back to the Visual Basic Editor. Now the good news is that we've already written most of the code that we need in order to edit the data from the form. All that code is stored behind the click event of the Add to List button. So basically the approach we're going to take here is that if we edit any data on the form, we're going to run the same procedure that adds data to the list in the first place. We just need to make a couple of modifications to it. So we're not going to take the approach where we test which values have been changed and only write those back. We're just going to write out the entire film record again. So to get started with this, let's double click the Add to List button to find its click event, and then we've got this Add Data to List procedure that we're calling to add data to the list. We're going to make a couple of modifications to this. First of all, we're going to declare an optional parameter called ID cell as a range. So now we can use this procedure to either add new data to the list or overwrite existing data based on the range that we pass into it. We need to make a few modifications here now as well. We don't want to select the film's worksheet. What we do need to do is check if ID cell is nothing, then this tells us that basically we're trying to add a new record to the next available blank row. So if that's the case, what we want to do is set the ID cell to be equal to whichever cell is the next available blank one in the film's worksheet. So it's ws films dot, and then the next line here, I'm just going to delete a few blank or empty spaces. I'm going to say ws-films.range b2.endXL down offset 1, 0. We don't want to select that cell anymore, we're just going to store a reference to it in this variable. Now previously this routine's been working based on column B, which is the list of film names. The ID cell is based on column A, so the current ID cell as we looked at before. So what I'm going to do is modify this so we're looking in column A, and then what we're going to do is change the value of that cell to be the next number in the sequence. So if we're adding a new film, we're going to say id cell.value equals, and then rather than all this code here, active cell offset 0, -1, we're going to change this so it's worksheet function.maxColumnsA plus 1, and then we can say end if. Now everything else from this point is essentially doing exactly the same thing as though we were adding a new row to the list. It's just that everything now, rather than being based on the active cell, is going to be based on the ID cell. And we've also got to update the offsets here as well. So now that we're operating in column A rather than column B, we've got to make a couple of modifications to the way we offset from that cell. So this part's a little bit tedious, admittedly, but what we're going to do is basically replace any reference to the active cell with a reference to ID cell. So I've just double-clicked on the ID cell and copied it to the clipboard. Then I can just double-click active cell and paste it in with Control V. So I need to do that for all of these items. I could just use find replace as well, I suppose, to replace active cell with ID cell. That would be a much simpler, quicker, easier solution. And if you prefer to do that, please do. And make sure and that will guarantee that we get all the active cell references as well, rather than the ID cell references. I'm gonna just also update the offset. So remember, we're working in column A now rather than from column B. So we need to make sure that we change all of the offsets for these cells. So the film name is 1 column to the right in column B, then the film gross is 2 columns to the right. So basically anywhere that was number 2 will be number 3, anything that was number 2 will be number 3, anything that was 3 it will be 4, and so on and so on and so on. So just updating all of these numbers. I said it was tedious, didn't I? Now you believe me. So apologies that this is taking a while to do, but we're nearly there. So making sure we've updated all of the offsets. Okay, so at that point, the last thing we need to do actually here as well is the sorting should only happen, and the message box should only happen if the form is in its add mode rather than its edit mode. So we're just going to wrap an if statement around this. We're going to say if form data mode equals add mode, then we're going to indent all of these lines in there and then say end if. Now, because we're not selecting the WS Films worksheet anymore, we also need to qualify references to our range objects. So we're going to say WS Films dot in front of all of these range references. Again, slightly tedious to do, so apologies for this, but it's important to make sure the whole thing still works if we add a new film. So let's make sure that all happens, and then, of course, the message box won't actually work either. We refer to the active cell.row. So what we're going to do here is refer to the ID cell.row instead. So I'm going to replace active cell there with ID cell. I just missed that one earlier. There are just a few other cell references that we also need to qualify with the name of the worksheet. So let's just copy WS Films dots to the clipboard again, and just scrolling back up, this is mainly to do with formatting the values once they're copied into the worksheet. So we've got this one here, range C3 number format, so let's say WS Films dot, and likewise range D3 WS Film dot, and range E3 WS Films dot. So having done all of that, we should be in a position now where we can call this procedure from an appropriate place. Again, we've got a variety of choices for when we could call this procedure. We could make it work like a Microsoft Access form. So in an Access form, when you change the value of a record and navigate to a new record, it automatically saves all the changes. So we could just call this procedure from our Navigate to Record procedure automatically. Probably, I think it makes more sense to have a specific dedicated button for the user to click on to save the changes they've made. At that point, then they kind of know exactly when the changes are going to be saved. This is, I guess, going to be down to your choice. However you want your form to work, you can code it so that it works that way. But I think for this example, what we're going to do is create a new button on the form that allows the user to click on to update the details. So let's head back to the object view of the form then to draw the button in the first place. And I'll draw a simple command button in the record navigation frame, change its size a little bit, and then a couple of its basic properties. So let's change its name so that it's called something like Save Record Changes, and its caption can be simply something like Save Changes, and then a quick double click on the button to get access to its click event handler. We want to make sure that we only save the changes if the record has been completely filled in. So again, a quick call to our everything filled in function. So if everything filled in, then, or in fact we could do it the opposite way around. We could say if not everything filled in, then exit sub. Otherwise, all we're going to do is call the add to list or add data to list subroutine. Here we want to pass in a reference to the current ID cell. So remember, that's the variable that we made public to the form earlier on, or so we extended its scope to the form, and as long as we open the form in edit mode, that will always have a reference to the current record that we're looking at, or the first cell of the row of the current record that we're looking at. So, having done all that, let's just switch back into Excel, and we can just give this one a quick test. So back onto the menu sheet, hit the Edit Films button, and let's try doing this one first of all. If we switch across to Deadpool, so apparently since I've started making this video series, its gross has increased up to $757 million. So at that point, if I've typed that in and I click Save Changes, the form was completely filled in. Just to prove that it's worked, if I navigate to the previous record and then go back to the next one, it's retained the changes that we've made. So there we go, that's how we can update data in the form. We'll add one more bit of functionality then to this section that lets the user delete the record that they're currently looking at. So let's cancel the form and get back to the Visual Basic Editor, and then head back to the design view of the form as we're already there, and we'll create a new button. So I'm just going to copy one of the existing ones, and I'll stick that towards the end of that row of buttons. We'll of course change a couple of things about it. So first of all, we'll change its name so that it's called something like delete this record or delete current record. So let's change its name in the properties window. I'll call this delete current record, and then I'll change its captions, so that's just a big giant X, and I'll probably just change its forecolor as well so that it looks a little bit more obvious that it's going to do something potentially not nice. So a big red X. Maybe I'll change its font to bold. I'll leave it at that for the time being, otherwise I'll just get tied up in formatting it. Okay, so all we're going to do then is add a bit of code to the click event of that button that will delete the current record. So let's double click on the button first to get access to its click event handler. Probably the most important part of this procedure is that we ask the user to confirm that they definitely do want to delete the record. So let's have a quick variable that's going to be called confirm, and we're going to store a VB message box result in there. We can set the value of the confirm variable to be equal to a message box, and then there's a few different parameters or arguments we'll pass into it. So we'll first of all set the prompt to be something like, are you sure you want to permanently delete this record? As that's what will happen. We'll have no way to retrieve the record once we've deleted it. So are you sure you want to permanently delete this record? With a question mark, and then a comma and a space underscore, the buttons that we'll provide. So first of all, I'm going to show a VB critical symbol on there to indicate to the user that something bad might happen if they just blindly click yes. Then we'll say we'll plus VB yes no buttons on there, so the user can click either yes or no. I want to make sure that the default button is the no button, so I'm going to say VB default button 2. So that makes sure that the no button will be the one that is clicked if the user presses enter. And then we'll just add in one more argument, so we'll pass an argument to the title parameter, so say title colon equals confirm deletion, something along those lines. Okay, so at that point we can then test if the user has clicked the yes or the no button. So we can say if confirm equals VB no, then exit sub. So that's our little safety net. So at this point we can assume that the user has clicked yes and they definitely do want to delete the record. So let's think about the things that we need to do to make this work. Deleting an entire row of data is actually remarkably simple. We've got access to the current ID cell variable, so we can say current ID cell dot entire row. Entire row really does mean the entire row on the worksheet, so everything from column A to column XFD. And then we're simply going to say delete. We can also specify how the other cells are shifted. I think by default the other cells will be shifted up, but you can explicitly say that by saying shift colon equals XL up if you really wanted to. If we do that, we just have to consider which record we might have been deleting. We might delete a record somewhere in the middle of the range, or we might delete the record that's right at the end. If we delete the record that was right at the end of the record set, then the current record ID will now be greater than the count of records in the record set. So we need to make sure that we handle that. So I'm going to have a quick if statement here that's going to say if current record ID is greater than the record count, then we're going to make current record ID equal to the record count. Otherwise, we just want to make sure that the record number and the record number label properties are updated, so the text and the caption properties are updated, so it reflects the new record count. So as long as we're not past the end of the record set, we're just going to say current record ID equals current record ID. So all this will do is just trigger the property let procedure for the current record ID property, and that will make sure that it updates the record number and record number label objects that have endif there. The very last thing to do then is tell this procedure to read the new details into the form. So we're going to have a call to the read film details procedure. So that's all done. Let's give this one a quick test. Just before we do this, we're going to add one extra little bit of code that tidies up the form when it's loaded in either add mode or edit mode. So the whole record navigation frame, it's only important if that becomes visible when we launch the form in edit mode. So if I just scroll back up to the top and look at the let, or the property let procedure for the form data mode, if we're in add mode, we basically want to make the entire record navigation frame invisible. So we can say record navigation frame dot visible equals false. And then just to make sure that it becomes visible again when we show the form in edit mode, we'll explicitly say to do that. So we'll paste that line of code in there and then say true instead. So at this point, if we switch back into Excel, we can now click the Add New Film button to launch the form without the navigation section displayed. When we click Edit Films, it will show the record navigation section. Okay, so let's start by actually adding in a new film that we can happily delete. If I click the Add New Film button, we'll just fill in some random old details, doesn't really matter what they are, and as long as we fill in all the required values, we need to check at least one genre. And if I click the Add to List button, it's added that new film into the worksheet. Let's just quickly check that that's there. So go on to sheet 1. Oh, it is there. This gives us a big clue. I must have missed one of my cell references pointing to the WS Films worksheet. I've accidentally created the same ID number twice, so it looks as though I've missed a little bit of code. Let's just quickly solve that problem before we continue with this. I'm just going to go back to the VB editor at this point then, and let's have a look if we can find the add data to list procedure. So that's going to be a little bit further down the page. So add data to list, here we go. So this is the bit that's calculating the ID value, or the new ID. Yes, so stupidly, apologies for this, I missed the reference to the WS Films worksheet there. So rather than just referring to columns A, that will of course refer to column A on whichever sheet is active when that line of code runs. So now we've explicitly said to look in column A on the WS Films sheet. Okay, so let's switch back into Excel and let's just give this one a quick test. If I go to the menu sheet again and add a new film, and I'll put in a different film this time, equally unimportant what the values are, but let's just make sure that this time we do indeed get, when I add this one to the list, the new ID number generated. So yes, so the new one goes in with the next ID number. So now we've got two films that we can delete from our list. So we can do this quite handily using the form that we've just created. So back to the menu sheet and let's show the form in edit mode this time. So let's start by navigating through the films until we find one that we do want to delete. So in fact, the second film in the list is one that we want to delete. So currently we're on record 2 of 8. If I click this delete button, that should bring the next film into play. So that should be Titanic. So if I click the delete button, confirm that I definitely do want to do this, clicking yes, that brings Titanic in and it updates the record count to 2 of 7. Perfect. So I just navigate to the very end of the list then. So I'm on the last one that I added. So I'm record 7 of 7, and if I choose to delete that one and confirm that I definitely do want to do that, I'm on now record 6 of 6. Perfect. So the whole system now works. Quite a long video that one, lots to do in there. There we go, that's how we can start using VBA forms to edit data in worksheets. As you can tell, it's quite a lot of work to do, but probably worth the effort, I think. Hopefully you agree. Hope you enjoyed that one anyway. Join us for the next one. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseL website where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.